Well, another week in our lives have passed by. Can you believe that? It goes by quickly, doesn't it? You think it's a long time, 7 days, that whole week, 168 hours, and all of a sudden you find yourself, it's another week, it's a new week. And as I was preparing our final little bit about Ruth here, I got to thinking about the number of decisions that we make just in a week, right? How many decisions do you think you made? Now, consciously or unconsciously, right? A lot of our decisions we don't really think about. We just naturally make them. And when you all get to be my age, you'll understand. But after a while, there are some things where you've decided. You already know this, you know that. And then there are those decisions that we have to think about. So what, like 100 decisions in a week? 100 decisions in an hour? Yeah, when you think about, if you ever stopped and thought about the number of decisions that your brain is rattling through, we laugh, but it's easily that many. Right? Just so many of them we're not conscious of. We're not thinking through. And then we have those huge decisions where we're just pondering on it for day after day after day after day until we come to the decision. So all that's going on in our minds, and we make all these decisions. And let's just take this morning. So this morning you've all been up since what, 3:30ish, somewhere there? Okay, so in that, oh my heavens, 7 hours that you've been awake, all the decisions that you make, right? How are you going to make your coffee? Should I let the dog out? All these things. How many of those decisions did you make with eternity in mind? Probably none, huh? Because we don't naturally think that way. We don't naturally think in this scope of eternity. We think super temporally. What am I going to do in the next second? And then maybe at an extension, what am I going to do over the next hour, the next day? But eternity doesn't come into play. And a big part of that is because the modern church has created this, I'm going to use a big word here, bifurcated idea. Whoa, huh? Bifurcated, Dan taught me that, Pasley. This bifurcated notion of eternity. And here's how it goes. And just check me if I'm wrong, right? Eternity begins right after you die. Huh? Because think about the way we talk. We talk about this person went on to their eternity. Or, someday when I pass on and Christ welcomes me, we talk about being welcomed into eternity. But in order for eternity to be eternity, that means that it had no beginning and it has no end. And so for us to make this hard break, eternity's over there, look at how that affects us. We don't think about the choices that we make often. We don't think about the things we do, the things that we decide over here. We don't think about those in terms of eternity and what effect those choices have into eternity. Because after all, eternity's not here for us yet. When we get to eternity, we'll think about things see, that's wrong. That's not at all the world that the Bible is talking about. When God is spoken of in eternal fashion, we get that. God always was, God always will be. But as far as I know, every one of us was born. And so we tend to think that history started, right? November 15th, 1960. Bam. That was that for me anyway. Okay, so that's the I know Brandy's going, how old is that guy? I know. Do the math. Okay, so that becomes history. That becomes our idea of history. And then as we come to learn about people around us, then, oh, so there's more history. Was it on or not?
No, yes, it's on, but not. You're going to be 61 this year.
That big word.
I love you too, Brandy. Okay. I think we have to buy a new microphone because this is getting a little hinky in its old age here. See what I did there? So we tend not to think of the choices that we make, the things we do in terms of eternity. We think today, what's going to happen today? What will result maybe tomorrow or next week or a month from now in eternal terms? Now you're asking, what does this have to do with the book of Ruth? Well, really the story of Naomi and Ruth and Boaz and the unnamed guardian redeemer, it all has a huge place in eternity. Every part of the story has an eternal implication. And we know this because we read about this story later on in Matthew. We see that, oh, wait, that wasn't just a nice story. That just wasn't a cute story that was put in here. Not only is it this bridge between Judges and Samuel when the king comes into play, but it tells a story that has eternal implications. And when we think about it that way, we don't think about it as just this little short story. Now, every point of tension in that story, every time somebody makes a choice, every decision that's made, everything that happens, well, now that plays out into eternity. And if any one of those choices, if any one of those decisions gets sideways, if any one of those decisions isn't made, if it was made to the contrary of what we see in the story, well, then we're left to ask what would happen. And the answer is, when we think eternally, when we develop that mindset, we begin to see how the choices that we make can be guided by the Holy Spirit. We begin to see how the choices that we make are used by God as a part of His plan for redemption. We can see how the choices that you and I make, the things that we elect to do, the things we elect not to do, when we choose to rebel, when we choose to fight against that rebellion, all these things have implications out into eternity. And so the things that you chose this morning, we sometimes take this Ecclesiastes view to where as the sun rises up, the flower of our decision today will just fade away and it'll be gone. Maybe. Or maybe that you chose this, that you chose this, that you chose this may really be a part of a bigger plan. And we see that in Ruth. Now, as we come to these final few sentences here, we're going to get a different perspective. And in filmmaking, this is what we're going to see is this thing called a dolly shot. You've all seen it, even if you don't know what it's called. So a dolly shot can work two ways. So let's say we're all the way zoomed in and we're reading the words on Bob's coffee cup over here. You got that? Okay, so squint your eyes really tight. And that's what we see. But then the camera begins to draw out a little bit. And as that picture broadens up, right, we get these people sitting in the front row. So now we've gained a different perspective on things, huh? The world is not composed of Bob's coffee cup, and we draw back. And then as that camera dollies back a little bit further, now the view draws out a little bit more, and we see the entire room. And you've seen this go on in movies where the camera keeps drawing back and back and back. And all of a sudden you're looking at the earth, right? And then, you keep going back and you find that earth that you thought was so big, that you thought was so enormous, is just this little speck. out there in space. And when you read Ruth, we read this and we dive in here. We get real close to the details of the story. We get really deep into what's going on. Oh, what's Boaz going to do? What's Ruth going to say next? How bitter is Naomi? And we get in there. But in this last bit of the story, we're encouraged to draw back, to see the bigger perspective of things. So you've got your Bible. We're going to open it up for the last time to Ruth, chapter 4. And we're going to begin in the last sentence here. Starting in verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Now, look at how far back the story has drawn. Did you notice who's included in this, who has been excluded up to this point? You see, up to this point in the story, the name of God has been hidden away. The name of God has been implied, but has not been explicit in the story. We've seen things that look like coincidence. We've seen things where people make contrary to God decisions, and yet he seems to work things out. So the hidden hand of God is always present in this. But now look at what the author tells us. That God has been involved all along. So when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her, Ruth, to conceive. So all of a sudden, God is front and center here. It is no longer just this convenient marriage. It is no longer this marriage where things are just going to happen. It is the Lord's hand moving in the lives. And so now you go back, now you draw back on the story. So Ruth did not just coincidentally walk into Boaz's field. Ruth did not just coincidentally decide to get up that day and go glean from the field. Naomi did not just coincidentally have Ruth come with her back to the land. Naomi and Elimelech did not just coincidentally decide to leave. Now we see that it has been God and his eternal plan for things, working all of this thing for good. And so now, as Ruth and Boaz have this new child in here, we're going to see how the story comes full circle. If you remember, when Elimelech and Naomi left, they left because of the famine in the land. They decided that it would be better to go live in enemy territory than it would be to stay and endure the famine. And so when they went there, Elimelech passes away. Their two sons pass away. And Naomi is bitter and empty. Naomi is crushed. And she feels that it is God who has brought this about. But now draw the camera back. Has God brought this about so that she'll return to the land? Has God brought this about so that Ruth, who is an integral part to his plan, will return back to the land with him? Has God emptied her? Has God taken away her identity so that she will once again return back into her people to regain her identity? So now that camera's really drawing back as these last few sentences of the story come about. Going back to verse 14, listen to how this baby is received. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer." That would be the baby. "May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. And he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Well, now the camera has truly drawn back because we're seeing the eternal place of this baby. But look at who the baby becomes. He's not just the grandson of Naomi. The women of Bethlehem view him now as Naomi's son. This is God refilling her. And so this blessing that they give over the child for him being born, well, they view this baby, Obed, much differently. They look at this child as the answer to Naomi's prayers. They look at this child as the one who is going to care for her in her old age. They look at this child as the answer to everything. This is not just some coincidental child. This is not some child that was born after Ruth prayed for 99 and a half years. Nothing like that. This is a child that God has brought into the world. And so not only is Boaz and Ruth, not only are they blessed, but Naomi is being refilled. She has an identity now. Her identity is being refilled because she has this kinsman redeemer that's been born of Ruth. And so little by little, she's being built up. Her identity is coming back. And we trust, even though it's not said, that her trust in Yahweh is coming back. That her sense that Yahweh is going to work everything out for good is beginning to come back. And when the women say that, may this little guy over here, this unnamed guy, may he be famous throughout Israel. Well, that's not for what he does. Okay? They're not blessing him and saying, boy, I hope he's famous. I hope everybody knows his name because of the mighty deeds that he's done. No, they hope that he's famous throughout all of Israel because he is the answer to prayer. He is the restoration of Naomi. He's the refilling of her identity. And that's why when they name him Obed. Obed is servant. And we remember how important Hebrew names are. Obed is the servant. The one given by God to take care of the one who's been emptied. And so the story sounds like it's happily ever after. And if it stopped right there, if the story ended right there, it would be, oh, that's great. That's awesome. But what we get is the camera moves back a little bit more. We're seeing that there's celebration in Bethlehem and hopefully celebration throughout all of Israel later on, because one who was emptied was refilled by God. And so that would be a part of the mythology, a part of the story of the people. But then the camera, the author, the narrator of the story backs up even further. He says, oh, you thought that was the end of the story. And then he gives us this genealogy, one of those parts of the Bible that we just skim past, right? We don't sit there and study these genealogies because the names are hard to say, and a lot of them we don't know. And yet, you know how you know that this one matters is because Matthew repeats it in leading up to the birth of another baby who will be a servant, a suffering servant. So in verse 18, the story concludes like this, not happily ever after, but this then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz. Boaz, the father of Obed, the servant. And Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of King David. Well, this story just in those last couple of sentences became so much bigger, didn't it? It is now beyond just the story of those three people, as important as they are. This story has just backed all the way out and said, that story that you just read, that story that you just looked at, and you thought those things were coincidence, you thought those things were happenstance, you thought that Ruth just happened to bump into Boaz, you thought that Naomi and Ruth came back at just the right, all those things that you thought just happened, all those things happened because each person in that play, in that story, has an eternal part in the story of God. And now it causes you to go back and reread that entire story, to go back and look at the choices they made. Wait, what if Elimelech and Naomi had never left? They never would have met Ruth. What if Ruth, when she was standing there with her other sister-in-law, her only sister-in-law, had said, no, you know what? I'll stay here with the Chemosh worshipers. I'll stay here. What if she'd have said that? What if Naomi had given up and said, well, I'm too worried about what people are going to say about me, so I'll just stay here? And what if they had gone back? And Naomi had told Ruth, no, you can't go out and glean. Or what if Ruth had said, you know what, I'm just going to hang around here and watch a little Oprah today, and then maybe tomorrow I'll go out and... What if? And yet the answer to what if, is that these choices that they make, the choices that these individuals made, God has worked them all, you know what I'm going to say, for good. Right? I mean, we say all these things, what if, as if God could have been foiled somewhere along this way. And we know that's not true. But it takes our decisions now and it puts them in that context. These choices that we made just this morning. Will some of them ring into eternity? Maybe we made a bad choice. Maybe we made good choices. Whatever it might be, God can use all those choices. And so when that camera pulls all the way back, and we're seeing, wait a minute, Obed is David's grandpa. Whoa. Now the story has radically changed. Now the story is something else. And all I could think of was Romans 8, where God works all things for good. Think about that. God works all things for good. This story about Naomi being refilled, God works for good. Naomi is an integral part of God's plan. She is a huge component of God's plan. And so God uses the choices, the decisions she makes to bring his plan about. And so choice, and God takes them all and he makes them work for good. And this helps us to believe that to be true. I know sometimes we can doubt that something bad comes into our life and we say, well, how's God working that for good? Well, we don't know. We don't know, again, because we don't tend to think in eternal terms. We tend to think about this hour right now. And so if something bad, something not positive happens, we tend to think of its effect right now. We don't think about how this is going to change us a week, a year, 10 years from now, and what God can do with us a week or a year or 10 years from now. But when we read this story, when we consider that, when we consider all the little twists and turns in this story, we place ourselves, I hope, we place ourselves in that same context. That God can use our choices. That God can use the decisions that we make and work them for good. I know as we read this, we saw all these good choices, bad choices, negative feelings, good feelings. And it's always tempting to think that at any point this thing could spin off its track. But remember, and this is why we bring this up so often, you've got to remember that it's God that's in control of things. And when God looks down and he sees Kenneth in the heavy big city traffic of Twin Falls, and he says, oh, don't do it, Ken, don't do it. And Ken loses his patience for a second, but God keeps him out of an accident. I think that's how your story went, right? Okay, so God keeps him out of an accident. Well, think about that eternally. Now, Ken could turn around and bless that person who ran the red light and almost scratched his shiny pickup truck. You see, God can use those things, but it requires, or we benefit from this change of mindset. We benefit from turning our minds from just now, from just this moment, from just this next day, into thinking eternally. What choice should I make in terms of all of time? What choice should I make? Not what's good today, not what benefits me today, but what choice should I make that could benefit or be a part of God's plan out into eternity? We change the way that we see things. When we begin to develop that mindset, we begin to look at things differently. We begin to make different choices. We say, well, I want to do this right now. I feel like I want to have this right now. I feel like this needs to be true right now. But when the Spirit begins to whisper in your ear, when you're more sensitive to that, when you're thinking eternally, the Spirit says, well, no, you don't. If you did this, that could benefit that person over there. If you made this choice over here, that would emphasize your faith to those people over here, and so on. And so these things that we have made in our idea of time, our time now, that's ticking down until we get to eternity, and we begin to see things and feel things and experience things much differently. And I know you're thinking, well, Pastor, that's true about all the good choices that we make, all the good decisions we make, but what about the bad decisions we make? I know this doesn't apply to any of you, but pretend that you knew someone who was rebellious against God, who was defiant of God's law. Can God use those things? Well, clearly. I mean, Naomi and Elimelech, right? They decided it was better to go off and live with the enemy than it was to endure the famine that God had brought into the land. And did God use that? Absolutely. And so even God can use, even our rebelliousness, our defiance, God can use all those things to work out his plan. And so when we think eternally, we think historically in terms of all of time, the things we do today are not just for today, they are for all of time, for all of history. And so we need to look at opportunities that same way. God may put opportunities before us. God may put an opportunity before you this afternoon. And we may be tempted to bypass it, to look past it, to ignore it. Remember, that opportunity may have eternal consequence. So I'm sure that now that we've come to the end of this story, we can look back and we can see now all the things that we've pointed out throughout the entire reading of the story, how God has been at work. And it's much easier because we know the end of the story. We know how the whole story concludes. But what about your life? Can you look at the story of your life in that same way? Do you know how your life ends? Well, here's the thing. Your life doesn't end. I know I mentioned this a few weeks back, but you are immortal. Every human being bearing the image of God is immortal. And whether it is God's people gathered together to hear from his word, or our neighbors across the street who are not yet God's people, every human being is immortal. And every human being bearing the image of God is going to know the consequence of their choices into eternity. There will not come a time where things change and a person becomes mortal. There's not going to become a time when things change and your choices back here do not affect your future off into eternity. And so we may question how God is at work. We may struggle to see how he's working all things for good, and that's okay. We don't need to see how everything is done and how everything is made. What we need to understand is that the reason that God is conforming us, that the Spirit is working to conform us to the image of Christ, is because the things that we do in this life, the things that we do today, the choices that we make right now, have eternal consequences. The story confirms it, but the entire story of God affirms that as well. And so here's what we can take from this. We can live as God's people today, believing and trusting, but we've got to believe and trust right, that God can use our lives. He can use the choices that we make, the decisions that we make today for the benefit of his plan tomorrow. Yeah? Amen? All right.